If there's one thing that trains are good at, it's being able to move a lot of stuff on one trip, which, in a world that relies on more deliveries with every passing day, is a good trait to have. Thus, it's quite natural to assume that the more you can take at once, the better. After all, long trains are said to reduce congestion, be more efficient, and overall cheaper to operate. So, it wouldn't be long before railroads around the world would test just how long they could go. Here's how they did it. In the early days, there wasn't much of a need for making trains as long as possible, since most railroads instead worked on simply outgrowing their network and outdoing competition. So the only trains that were considered long were usually publicity stunts, which are unknown if they were verified for any sort of record. Either way, business came first, and these long trains weren't very high on top of the priority list, especially during the 1930s when the Great Depression made business especially low, and Art Deco streamlining was the big craze. It wasn't until 1941, with America's entry into World War II, that the demand for heavy freight spiked up again. Even though the world's longest train might not have been a direct result of this high rail traffic, the opportunity would actually spring up after the war. In the mid to late 1940s, following the end of war, it soon became apparent that many people in France and Italy were suffering hard from hunger and destruction. As a response to this, in November of 1947, the many farms, businesses, and railroads across the United States put their heads together to form the Friendship Train. Departing California and heading eastbound through 11 states, it became a wild success, with millions of people nationwide pitching in. Townsfolk, trucks, and even rail ferries helped to deliver as much food as they could. The cities of Chicago and Philadelphia alone each donated more than 20 boxcars worth of various grains. All this, combined with the numerous other donations, made the train so long that it had to split into sections east of Chicago. By the time it had completed its journey, the food collected among the sections totaled to 270 cars. Even though it's unknown if this was officially verified as the world's longest train, it was definitely foreshadowing of what was to come. Soon after the food was sent to Europe, in time for Christmas no less, and life went back to normal, there once again wouldn't be any new attempts for a record-breaking train for a while. But the post-war years did bring with them a big new player in the railroad industry. Even though steam power has frequently been considered faster, stronger, and the fan favorite, one major benefit to diesels was the ability to run several engines at once, known as a lash-up. Before that, running multiple steam engines on a single train was expensive and required several crews, but with diesels, a single engineer could operate every engine simultaneously. This would start what is known as distributed power, where engines are placed in the middle and or rear of a train to effectively distribute the weight. Because of this, freight trains had the potential to grow much longer, and the first one to really put this to the test was the Norfolk and Western. In 1967, the N&W tested several big coal trains running through West Virginia and Ohio. These totaled over 400 cars each, and in November, they peaked with a train of 6 engines and 500 cars. This was the first time since the Friendship Train that a long train was publicly recorded, and this time, it was officially declared the world's longest. Though the run was more or less a success, there was still room for improvement. On test runs, there were reports of the mid-train helpers being disconnected from the leaders, and in the middle of the 500-car run, it suffered a coupler breakage, which was quickly repaired. Nevertheless, this was still a solid record that would stand for several decades, until an unlikely source would eventually make it beaten. When you think of big railways and long trains, South Africa probably isn't the first country that comes to mind. But in August of 1989, after years of planning, the Sishan-Saldanha rail line put itself on the map with an iron ore train of 660 cars. Not only was this much longer than the Norfolk and Western's record over 20 years prior, it was also more unique. Sishan-Saldanha's train had 16 engines, 9 of which were electric, and the other 7 were diesel. The train also had several passenger cars for officials to ride in, a tank car, and a flatbed with a container, likely holding diesel fuel and extra parts respectively in case they were needed. Early in the morning on the day of departure, as the train was being assembled at the Sishan mine, disaster struck. An ore car jumped the tracks, derailed, and blocked several lines. Men from both the railway and the mine had to work fast to get it back on without being late. Fortunately, they did, and the train made the 500-plus mile trip with no other recorded problems, while also making its way into the record books as the new longest train. So then, there's one big question here. If this is the world's longest train, why is it so hard to find any documentation of? I mean, think about it. The internet came out not even 10 years after the train was set, and the only things I could dig up for research were a small handful of articles and some old films. What's with all the obscurity for such a big achievement? I mean, the only way that would be possible is if another train managed to beat the record. Oh, right. In June 2001, less than 12 years after South Africa's run, the Australian mining company BHP Billiton decided to take its own shot at the record. Unlike South Africa, this was done using all diesels, 8 examples of the newest in locomotive technology at the time, the General Electric AC6000. The amount of cars? 682, breaking the old record by the skin of their teeth. Despite being a short trip of 170 miles from Newman to Port Hedland, and suffering a coupler failure partway in, the train had well made its mark by the time it finished its journey, quickly becoming noticed across the globe to this day as the world's longest train. And that is where the record stands today. Since then, interest in making long test trains has more or less died down again, with the most recent test conducted by Union Pacific in January 2010. This train, running between Dallas and Los Angeles, consisted of 295 cars and 9 engines. Still an impressive train, but far from the overall world record pace. In more recent years, coal and container trains of similar sizes continue to run along North American railroads in regular service. However, once again, these will hardly match any of the top records anytime soon. So how long will it take until Australia's record is finally broken? That's hard to say, but it definitely won't be the world's longest train forever. After all, if there's one thing for sure about world records is that they're always prone to change. Maybe the United States or South Africa will make another try, or Australia can make an even bigger attempt, or perhaps some other country will take its own shot at the record. Until then, though, we can simply wonder who will be next to step up to the plate for the title of the world's longest train. Thanks for watching.